If there is one thing we have learned so far, it is that the conspiracy theorists were wrong about Queen Elizabeth II being immortal. After ascending the throne in 1952, Queen Elizabeth II went on to rule for over 70 years, earning herself the title of the longest reigning monarch. As one would expect, she gained many admirers and foes along the way. As the saying goes, all good things must come to an end, and so did the reign of Queen when she passed on September 8, 2022 at the ripe age of 96. In today's video, we are going to pay our last respects to the late British monarch by doing a deep dive into the life that she lived. If you have ever wondered what Queen Elizabeth II could have witnessed in all her 96 years of living, well, you are about to find out. Queen Elizabeth II was born as Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor of York on the 21st of April, 1926 in Mayfair, London, United Kingdom. She was born to Prince Albert and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who were then the Duke and Duchess of York. In her childhood, Elizabeth was often described by her grandmother, Queen Mary of Teck, as someone who carried the aura and intelligence of a future ruler. Apart from her grandmother, when asked about Elizabeth's conduct, her childhood governess, Marion Crawford, said she was an orderly girl with an attitude of responsibility. Winston Churchill also seemed to agree with the others who spoke highly of Elizabeth because he referred to her as a girl with an air of authority. Her older cousin, Margaret Rhodes, described her as a cheerful little girl who was fundamentally sensible and very well behaved. 4 years later, on August 21, 1930, the family was blessed with the birth of Princess Margaret. Though they were of royal descent, both Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret enjoyed an ordinary enough childhood because their father was a second child and not the heir to the throne. All this changed, however, on the night of December 11, 1936, when Elizabeth's uncle, then King Edward VIII, abdicated his throne to her unsuspecting father and assumed the role and duties of a prince instead. As a result of King Edward VIII's actions, Elizabeth's nuclear family was thrown into the limelight. Her father became king, and being the first child, Elizabeth automatically became the heiress of the throne. She was only 10 years old at the time. With her father as the new king, Elizabeth and her sister Margaret's lives changed. Elizabeth, from the view of the public eye, seemed to adjust well to her new role and title, while her sister Margaret seemed to be doing poorly with the increased attention. The one thing that didn't change about Elizabeth and Margaret's life after their father took the throne was their approach to education. Both princesses received standard education at home under the expert supervision of their governess, Marion Crawford, and their mother, the Queen. Their lessons consisted mainly of language, literature, history, art, and music. As she grew older, Elizabeth received further education beyond the expertise of Marion Crawford. She received private lessons on constitutional history from Henry Martin, who was the vice provost of the esteemed Eton College at the time. She also learned to speak fluent French from a number of native-speaking French governesses. In the quest to have Elizabeth grow up well-rounded, especially in the area of socialization, the first Buckingham Palace Company was formed. It gave Elizabeth the chance to mingle with other girls her age. The 20 members of the company were made up of other children of members of the royal household and palace employees. It was a girls' guide group, and at their first meeting on the 9th of June 1937, Elizabeth was elected second of the Kingfisher Patrol, and her cousin, Patricia Mountbatten, was elected patrol leader. They met at a summer house in the Buckingham Palace garden. At about the same time, a brownie pack of 14 members was formed for Princess Margaret, who was only 7 at the time. Elizabeth enjoyed having her company around almost as much as she enjoyed the company's activities. She also enjoyed the company of horses and dogs. When she was 13 years old, Elizabeth met her future husband, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, who at that time was simply her cousin. They were third cousins through Queen Victoria and second cousins once removed through King Christian IX of Denmark. Though only 13, Elizabeth fell in love with Philip and they began exchanging letters. In September 1939, when Elizabeth was 14, Britain officially entered the Second World War. Due to her mother's refusal to be far away from her husband or children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and her mother moved to Balmoral Castle in Scotland to avoid the aerial bombings London was suffering. The princesses contributed by staging pantomimes to help the Queen's Wool Fund, which bought yarn to knit into military garments. The following year, in an attempt to restore hope in the hearts of displaced children, Elizabeth made her first broadcast of the BBC News Children's Hour. She spoke of the efforts of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. She also spoke of the royal family's duty to bear their share of the danger and sadness of war. Elizabeth spent much of her teenage years under the dark cloud of the Second World War. As heir apparent, she found herself in the midst of expectations, and she amassed several vital responsibilities. Fortunately, the early predictions about Elizabeth were accurate, and she handled her duties well. In 1945, at the end of the war, Elizabeth enjoyed an incognito time in the celebrating crowds with her sister, Margaret. She was 18 at the time. After the war, Elizabeth enjoyed a tour with her parents, visiting southern Africa. Upon her return from the tour, Elizabeth's engagement to Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was announced. The news was met with negative reactions. Many people believed that Prince Philip was not good enough for Princess Elizabeth. This was mainly because Philip was foreign-born and had no money, assets, home, or kingdom to match his title. The second reason was that Philip had sisters who were married to high-ranking German officials that were linked to the Nazis. Despite the ill reception, the engagement was not canceled, and Elizabeth's parents, especially her father, supported her decision to marry Philip. However, there were a few adjustments Philip had to make to become Elizabeth's husband. The first was that he denounced his title as a Prince of Greece and Denmark. He officially converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism and assumed the role of Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, adopting the surname of his mother's British family. Also, his family members who had any kind of connections with Nazi Germany were not invited to the wedding ceremony. Before the wedding, Philip was given the title of the Duke of Edinburgh by the king. Upon his marriage to Elizabeth, he was addressed as His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Philip and Elizabeth were married in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947. The following year, just 6 days shy of her first wedding anniversary, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles. 2 years after, Princess Anne was born. Elizabeth enjoyed her time as a wife and mother with limited royal duties up until early 1952, when she received news of her father's passing while recuperating from a New Zealand tour in her Kenyan home. Elizabeth quickly returned to Britain, moved into Buckingham Palace, and officially assumed her duties as Queen on the 6th of February, 1952. Her coronation ceremony was the first to be televised. At the time of her ascension, she became the head of multiple independent states that were under the Commonwealth. There was a small commotion about what to name her household, as the royal household was usually named after the man's surname. Prince Philip sought to name it the House of Mountbatten or the House of Edinburgh, but this suggestion was met with strong opposition. Finally, Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, decided that it had to be called the House of Windsor, which it was. When Prince Philip complained about being the only man in the country not allowed to pass on his surname to his children, Elizabeth formed the conjoined surname Mountbatten-Windsor for their male descendants with little or no claim to the throne. The early years of Elizabeth's reign were marked with several tours around countries of the Commonwealth. She became the first reigning monarch to visit many of the countries under the Commonwealth, such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Nepal, and Iran, among others. She even visited Ghana at a time when her host, Kwame Nkrumah, was a target for assassination. After a decade of her reign in the early to late 1960s, Britain experienced a detachment from many of its colonies as more and more countries in Africa and the Caribbean islands fought for their independence. By 1970, Britain had lost 10 of its colonies. Fearing that the rapid independence fight of its colonies would weaken the British Empire, Britain sought to develop friendships with other European countries. This led to Elizabeth touring Yugoslavia in 1972 and becoming the first British monarch to visit a communist country. Despite being a queen with numerous responsibilities who was loved by her subjects, Queen Elizabeth II made it a point of duty to be present in the lives of all her 4 children: Prince Charles, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. When she welcomed her first grandchild in 1977, she gracefully took on the role of a doting grandmother. During her lengthy reign, Queen Elizabeth II would go on to be the first monarch to do many things in Britain's history. She celebrated her silver jubilee at the age of 50 years old, and went on to celebrate her golden jubilee despite the death of her mother and sister earlier that same year. She also celebrated a diamond wedding anniversary with Prince Philip, who was also blessed with lengthy years. After several years of sitting on the British throne, Queen Elizabeth would live on to see several of her great-grandchildren. And as she got older, her role in Britain became more and more ceremonial, giving her more time to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, like attending sports games with her family. Since she was blessed with long life, Elizabeth lived through numerous world tragedies and family tragedies also. However, many argue that none of these tragedies hit her as hard as the death of her husband. In 2021, at the age of 99, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away. Following Prince Philip's passing, people around the world expressed their condolences, especially to the aged queen who had not been apart from her dear husband in decades. On September 8, 2022, a little over a year after her husband passed, Queen Elizabeth II passed away at Balmoral Castle, Scotland, after a brief battle with an illness. After 70 years and 214 days of sitting on the British throne, Queen Elizabeth breathed her last, leaving her throne to her first son, King Charles. A few hours before her death, Elizabeth's children and grandchildren gathered at Balmoral Castle to say their final goodbyes. Needless to say, Queen Elizabeth's death spelled the end of an era for people all around the world.